Thank you very much for this introduction and for the invitation, because it's a fascinating subject and totally relevant for nowadays. So I'm very happy to participate in it. I apologize for speaking in English, because it's not my mother tongue either, but I'm more at ease with English than with German. So, but I made a PowerPoint to visualize a bit what I, especially the quotes that I give, so that hopefully the language is not too much of an obstacle here. So I try to share my screen now. Yes, there it is. Right. So I changed the context, because the context changed. I changed the lecture to the introduction, at least. And I begin with the 19th century English poet Coleridge. He once used a phrase to describe the enjoyment of literature that has since become a catchphrase for literary scholars, though the concept itself is much older, from Aristotle, actually. Reading fiction and engaging with it is, and here's the quote, the willing suspension of disbelief. Coleridge wanted, when writing about supernatural characters or events, such as in his Rime of the Ancient Mariner, to achieve, and I quote, a human interest and a semblance of truth sufficient to procure for these shadows of imagination that willing suspension of disbelief for the moment, which constitutes poetic faith. It's an experience that every reader will recognize, if only from the fairy tales of his or her childhood, or Harry Potter from your teenage years, if you have the right age. You knew there are no such creatures as dementors, and still they gave you the creeps. I'll resist the temptation to reflect on voters who do not want to acknowledge that their candidate lost the election, and other examples of the very real tension between reality and make-believe. But that's just, in these days, very important issue. By extension, Coleridge's purpose basically goes for all fiction, not only for this supernatural thing, if his Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And not only, it is perfectly respectable and accepted intention for writers to create a life-likeness of their fictitious world and make readers suspend their disbelief. There is one domain of literature, however, where that catchphrase causes trouble, and that is Holocaust fiction. Readers would be all too willing to disbelieve the horrible world that Holocaust literature depicts, but no serious author would aim at a suspension of that intuitive disbelief. The horrors may be almost beyond imagination, yet they were part of reality, and readers should always be aware of that. No wonder that Holocaust fiction has long been a contested genre. We all know Adorno's famous dictum that writing a poem after Auschwitz is barbaric. But for our topic, a somewhat lesser known statement by ELIE WIESEL is of greater relevance. A novel about Treblinka is either not a novel or not about Treblinka. A novel about Majdanek is about blasphemy, is blasphemy. He seems not only to question the legitimacy, but to downright deny even the possibility of fiction about the Holocaust. His quote is from the late 1980s. In more recent work by literary theorists such as Sue Weiss, Ruth Franklin, and Emily Miller Budig, this view is refuted. The title of Ruth Franklin is hardly visible, but her book is titled A Thousand Darknesses, Lies and Truth in Holocaust Fiction. So nowadays, the taboo on fiction has become less rigid, if not completely dissolved. It is interesting to see how WIESEL himself dealt with the issue of fiction versus factuality. But in looking into that, we should be aware of his general situation as a writer. In the United States, a strict interpretation of the First Amendment of the Constitution offers a free license to all kinds of Holocaust deniers. WIESEL himself was targeted very aggressively by them. I was shocked to read on a revisionist website how an article by the very respectable scholar Naomi Zeitman, there's no negative connotation with her, but she wrote an article and that was twisted into an argument that WIESEL was an imposter, suggesting that he had never been in any concentration camp. Naomi Zeitman just showed the similarities between the first version of Night, which appeared in 1956 in Yiddish. My Yiddish is not so good, but Und die Welt hat geschwiegen. And the French text from 2 years later that has become so famous. And that is about 1/4 the size of the original version. A few years ago, the website of the Society for Free Historical Research popped up first when I Googled on Zeitman's and WIESEL's name. Apparently not educated in literary science, these revisionists confused the use of literary devices with lying. For your reassurance, nowadays the whole revisionist society seems to have vanished from the Google realm. So that's a positive development. But it was a few years ago that I did this Google search and found this website. Indeed, analysis showed WIESEL used these literary devices much more amply than even I was aware when first reading Night. I remember that working on my PhD thesis, I read an article how literary techniques are used especially in scenes of crisis to get the reader emotionally involved. One of such crises in many texts on the Holocaust is the first arrival in Auschwitz and the bewildering experience of entering a completely unknown and alien world where one is reduced to a number, to nothing more than vermin. I checked the theory by marking in different colors the various literary techniques mentioned, like metaphors, such as my use of the word vermin just now, broken grammar, divergent times in the verbs, stylistic means like repetition and rhetorical questions, and breaches of the narrative perspective. And lo and behold, that third chapter of Night that I, till then, had deemed a direct, straightforward account of a terrible experience, showed a multitude of colored markings. WIESEL did indeed profusely use stylistic tools to relate the moment of crisis. Obviously, though not obvious for the Revisionist Society for Free Historical Research, This applying of stylistic instruments does not make the text into fiction. Literary quality is not identical with fiction. In his literary work, WIESEL himself struggled with the dilemma whether to use fiction or not for conveying his message. In his autobiography, he relates how, as a 15-year-old boy, he witnessed some pious rabbis in Auschwitz conducting a lawsuit against God, concluding this lawsuit, these rabbis concluding that God was guilty of breaching the covenant with his people. WIESEL tried to make a literary text on this event, but efforts to write a novel, a theater play, even a cantata, all failed. Finally, he wrote a theater play. It's called The Trial of God. And it was set in a different age and at a different location, the 17th century, in a Polish village during a pogrom by the Cossacks, The Trial of God. Much later, in 2008, the BBC used the legendary event in Auschwitz for a television play by Frank Cottrell Boyce, titled God on Trial. Theologians who want to address the theodicy, I struggle with this word, theodicy, with regard to the Holocaust, should take note of this BBC production. The various positions that we know from Jewish responses to the Holocaust, from ultra-orthodoxy to modernist atheism, are represented by various characters, while the audience's sympathy and possible agreement shifts from one to the other. Nevertheless, when I once attended a screening of the film in the presence of some survivors of the concentration camps, I was struck by their negative judgment of the whole setting of the story. They considered it unimaginable that camp prisoners would have been able to perform such a procedure. In the left-hand picture, you see the so-called court in Auschwitz dealing with the indictment. So the real survivors thought it was not possible that people in the camps, prisoners in the camps, had the time, for instance, to do so, to do such a procedure. It lasted in WIESEL's version and in this BBC version. It lasted all night long. Clearly, a clash between factual reality and imaginative truth, in spite of WIESEL's claim that such a lawsuit had really happened. So this clash was there in the screening in the presence of real survivors. I will take another example of this tension between fiction and historical truth from Dutch literature. The renowned historian, at least in the Netherlands, renowned, Jacques Presser, Jewish himself, survived the war in hiding. 5 years after the liberation, the Dutch government, gave him the assignment to write the history of the persecution and extermination of the Jews in the Netherlands. Naturally, he started with research, a lot of research. The government had thought it would take him 2.5 years to write it, but it took him some 7 years before he was ready to start writing. At that point, however, he found himself unable to, a writer's block. He could only overcome that by writing a novella, and it's called The Night of the Girondists in English, translated also in German as Die Nacht Der Girondisten. By the way, Primo Levi used this German translation to make an Italian one of this novella. And it's also translated into English and published in America in quite, I'll show you the covers. They are repulsive to me. So much sensationalism in the layout of the covers. So I'll just get back to the German and Dutch version. So the novella is about a Jewish history teacher who is imprisoned in transit camp Westerbork. He joins the camp police and thus basically the side of the persecutors from an urge of self-preservation. He really dirties his hands in that position. He carries, for example, his favorite student, a girl he secretly was in love with, to the deportation train. And he leads the operation in which the Jewish lunatic asylum at Apeldoornse Bos is evacuated, one of the most infamous events of the Jewish persecution in the Netherlands. In the novella, it has another name, but the event clearly is the same. For theologians, the novella's final act is of extra interest. In the transit camp, Jacques meets the Rebbe Jeremiah Hirsch, who gradually manages to show him the value of Judaism and teaches him that human dignity outranks the law of the jungle which reigned in the camp. Jacques even starts to read the Bible. Yet he does not refuse to be the messenger who reads the transport lists for Sobibor with the names of Hirsch and his family, and to supervise the loading of the train. When his name is called, Hirsch tellingly responds with Hineni, the Hebrew for here I am. Among others, Abraham's response to God when called to sacrifice Isaac. On the platform, Hirsch stumbles and drops his little Bible. Jacques' superior, Cohen, the man who had coaxed him into taking the perpetrator-like position, gets angry, punches Hirsch in the face and kicks the Bible away. That finally is the breaking point for Jacques. He rebels against Cohen's game and ends up in the punishment barrack, from where he will inevitably be sent on the next train to Poland. Back from the novella to its author, Jacques Presser. It was only after writing this fictional account of Camp Westerbork, for which he used a lot of the research results that he had collected in the previous years. So it was only after writing this fictional account that he was able to start writing his historiography, which resulted in 1965 in Untergang, published in English as Ashes in the Wind, the Destruction of Dutch Jewry. I don't know of any German translation. Now, filmmaker Claude Lanzmann, who since his documentary Shoah was considered one of the world's leading Holocaust experts, was quite taken by the English translation of the novella and recommended a French translation to be published in the journal Le Temps Moderne, of which Claude Lanzmann himself would become the chief editor in 2016. But the journal rejected the French text without explanation. It was published by a different publisher, and at its presentation, a staff member of Lanzmann protested in public and accused Presser of being an imposter because he had never been in Westerbork, which is true. Apparently, Landsman had thought the book was autobiographical. The misunderstanding is easily conceivable. The main character is a history teacher at the same school where Presser taught, the Vossius Gymnasium in Amsterdam. His first name is Jacques, which he later changes to Jacob, as Presser did. The woman to whom he tells his story in the punishment barrack has the same name as Presser's real wife. Yet Presser never stated anywhere that it was about his own experiences. Landsman was so irritated because he held on to his firm conviction that the subject of the Holocaust should be forbidden territory for fiction. And that is the trouble with this topic. It seems to inspire absolute claims. WIESEL and Landsman are the most prominent representatives of what is called the mystical approach of the Holocaust, as an event that can never be conveyed to somebody who wasn't there. In the words of ELIE Wiesel, just as no one could imagine Auschwitz before Auschwitz, no one can now retell Auschwitz after Auschwitz. Clearly, this is a problem for autobiographical literature. But in Wiesel's eyes, it makes fiction about the Holocaust, as we have seen, completely impossible. He considers it as an insult to the dead. With Claude Landsman, we have arrived at the genre of film. Undoubtedly, the best-known Holocaust film is Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List. It is based on a novel by Thomas Keneally, Schindler's Ark, who in turn used a survivor's testimony for that novel. But the film, Schindler's List, aroused Claude Landsman's wrath. He stated that his own representation of the Holocaust in his 9 hours long documentary Shoah was the only integer, honorable way of doing it. Spielberg's film, by the way, won 7 Oscars, and its takings were used for the world-encompassing project of recording survivors' testimonies on videotape, resulting in 52,000 interviews in 37 languages, and now expanded to the Armenian, Rwanda, and Guatemala genocides and the Nanking massacre, resulting in 3,000 more interviews. But this is in parentheses, because as a researcher, I myself am an eager user of this collection, despite the obvious flaws noticeable in almost every interview. Landsman, as a filmmaker, is, in my view, not completely on the same side with Landsman, the critic. I'll go back to this one. I don't know if you're familiar with his documentary, but some of you may have seen the scene where the hairdresser Bomba relates how he had to cut the hair of women about to be gassed. He does so you see it in the right-hand picture, he does so in a hairdresser's shop, a barber shop, busying himself with cutting the hair of a male customer. This scene is totally staged. The colleagues and customers are random figurants, and when you look closely, you see that Bomba does not really cut the customer's hair, just making the moves and sounds with the scissor. So Landsman too uses fiction to draw the audience, and presumably Bomba in the first place, into the memory of the scene in Auschwitz that Bomba tells about. In no way do I mean to say that Bomba's experiences are fiction, but the setting of him telling them is fictionalized. Another critic of the way the Shoah is treated in literature and film is Lawrence Langer. He demurred to the tendency to try and learn lessons from the Holocaust, something he observed particularly, I have to say, with theologians and philosophers. He calls this pursuit exemplarist. He detects, and I quote, a persisting myth about a triumph of the spirit that colors the disaster with a rosy tinge and helps us to manage the unimaginable without having to look at its naked and ugly face. The effect of this fencing off the Holocaust as a literary topic other than for strictly testimonial literature is a kind of ownership of the Holocaust by survivors, which excludes even the second generation, let alone the third generation. Authors like Jonathan Safran Foer, Arnon Grunberg from the Netherlands, and Katja Petrovskaya show a tendency to literary experiments. They thematize their distance to the event that marked their parents or grandparents. This distance becomes a topic in itself. Perhaps the best known example is Art Spiegelman with his graphic novel Mouse. By the way, in a letter to the editor, he protested when the New York Times listed him in the bestseller list of fiction, arguing that Mouse is not a work of fiction. His book must be among those the most commented on by literary scholars, who are much more interested in this literature of the second and third generation than the general non-experimental testimonial literature, which mainly sticks to realism and a chronological order. So not very challenging for literary scholars. Yet in general, the relative proximity to the Holocaust of the second and third generation, which extends to Jewish authors in general, is an element that can count on the critic's benevolence. So much so that it is hard to come up with a literary representation of the Holocaust written by someone who was not there, nor a descendant of someone who was there, nor Jewish him or herself. That, however, goes only for literature from the perspective of the victims. There is a growing body of fiction about Holocaust perpetrators, like Bernard Schlink's Dear Voorlezer, Jonathan Littell's Les Bienveillantes, the kindly ones, or in German, Die Wohlgesinnten, and Martin Amy's Time's Arrow and The Zone of Interest, to mention only the best known examples. Maybe this genre is less contested than Holocaust fiction, is less contested than Holocaust fiction from the traditional perspective of the victims, because there are very few published autobiographical perpetrator texts. The perpetrator novels aim not so much at justification as at enlarging our understanding and our awareness that they, the perpetrators, basically are not different from us. Consider the sentence at the end of the introduction of The Kindly Ones, like a climax, or at least a summary of the preceding 20 pages, with very much emphasis. I am a man like you. I tell you, I am just like you. So that is the whole issue of the novel, at least in the words of this character, Auer, Max Auer. I leave aside the scandal about Benjamin Wilkomirski's Bruchstücke, fragments. This memoir by a Swiss author who claimed to have survived the Holocaust as a Latvian child was admired by audience and critics alike until an investigating journalist discovered that the author had been a Swiss illegitimate child who had spent his early years in an orphanage. As far as I know, it remains unclear if these wartime memories were deliberately made up or if it is a case of false memories. The historian is a pathological phenomenon. The historian who researched the matter after the exposure by the journalist concluded later that a work that was considered a masterpiece now, after its historical basis proved to be false, turned into kitsch instead of being hailed as great fiction. Crucial in this affair is that the autobiographical pact, as Philippe Lejeune labels it, a French theorist, that this pact has been violated. That pact is the silent agreement between writer and reader of diaries or memoirs that the narrator or main character of the story coincide with the author. Matters like memory lapses or exaggerations or things like that do not fundamentally harm the pact, because we all suffer from memory lapses from time to time. It is more about the intentions of both sender and receiver of the text. I do not know how to judge cases of false memory, like Wilkomirski's, in this respect. If his so-called memoirs were not intentionally made up, then perhaps there was no intentional violence of the autobiographical pact. Something similar was the matter with a Dutch author, Boudewijn Buch, German name, but Dutch author, who wrote a generally acclaimed novel about the death of his young son and his own Jewish descent into the bargain, but that's not relevant. Not only did he make his readers believe him, even his closest friends did so, and who knows if he himself did not as well. Can we talk about a violation of the autobiographical pact if authors genuinely believe in their own lies? Because this Boudewijn Buch never had a son that died at the age of 6. Literary criticism did not denounce Buch's novel. And for many years, it has remained a hit in high school reading lists. So there's this difference between Wilkomirski writing about his memoirs on the Holocaust, false memoirs, and Buch, and the effect it has on the public appreciation. Right. Diametrically, on the other side of the spectrum of fiction versus non-fiction is historiography. Historiography is on facts, or is supposed to be so. Historian Hayden White, however, showed how even historiography uses a certain amount of fiction. For instance, what is an historian's starting point in the representation of a certain event? Does the Holocaust start with Hitler's rise to power? And what exactly was the starting point of that? With the Nuremberg laws? Or with the 19th century anti-Semitism? Or even medieval anti-Semitism and the Crusades? And when did it end? With the liberation of the camps? with the death of the last survivor? Or is it transferred to the second and third generation? Is there no end at all yet? In his wake, in Hayden White's wake, literary scholar James Young points out that every reconstruction of the past means an interpretation and contains elements of fictionality. Think, for example, of the selection of details and the chronological and/or causal connections that are made. After all, the causes for certain events can often only be identified in hindsight and can be completely overlooked as such at the moment they occur. Although diaries, chronicles, and memoirs generally have the authority of the eyewitness, they are often less reliable as a source of information because of their lack of distance to events, because they are often incomplete. As an example, Young gives the sometimes flourishing cultural life in camp or ghetto, seen by the chronicler or diarist as a form of spiritual resistance to dehumanization. While we know from other sources that the Nazis sometimes encouraged such activities to distract the prisoners from the transports or to keep them quiet by allowing them their pleasures. Because of this aspect of unreliability, James Young reads such literary testimonies more as historical exegesis than as documentary evidence. Fiction has that quality of exegesis only in part. It does not show how people at the time interpreted the events. It lacks authenticity, to bring another phrase into play next to truth and reliability and self-evidence. So authenticity. Yet it does offer a form of exegesis, namely the interpretation of events at the time of writing. If it concerns realistic fiction, I leave obvious demands as, and now this difficult word, verisimilitude, truthworthiness, and the absence of sensationalism, think of the covers of Jacques Presser's novella, or sentimentalism, I leave those demands aside for now. In the surrealism that is now employed by second and third generation writers, matters are different and much more complicated. So they do make use of sensationalism and do not adhere to factuality. But that is a really complicated matter. So when we return to ELIE WIESEL, in this light of the literature, the fiction as exegesis, it would be legitimate for us to read a memoir such as his Night as theodicy, as has often been done, not least by Christian theologians, or perhaps better as a negation of theodicy. There is, however, an element in many theological readings of Night that I, as a literary scholar, do object to. And that is that one of the most crucial qualities of literature is ignored: its deliberate ambiguity. The scene that seems to appeal most to Christian theologians is the one with the young boy who is hanged. He's emaciated, and his weight is too light to break his neck, unlike his two adult companions. Thus, the news slowly strangles him, and his death struggle lasts and lasts. The first-person narrator hears a man behind him asking, "For God's sake, where is God?" And he hears a voice within him answer, "Where he is? This is where, hanging here on this gallows." And then the chapter concludes, "That night the soup tasted of corpses." By many Christians, this scene is read as a metaphor for Christ on the cross, or more in unison with Judaism, for the God who suffers the same pain and sorrow as his people. And the text allows this interpretation. But another reading is just as possible, and even more plausible, to use that phrase, in my view. Namely, that the first person narrator witnesses the death of God. This would be in line with a previous chapter about his arrival in Auschwitz, where he sees babies being burned alive in a pit, and reflects, "Never shall I forget those flames that consumed my faith forever. Never shall I forget those moments that murdered my God and my soul." But then in the last sentence, the text continues, again inserting ambiguity. "Never shall I forget those things, even were I condemned to live as long as God himself." Is the scene of the boy on the gallows a representation of the death of God or of the suffering God? It is the great power of this memoir, it is the great power of literature, that both interpretations can be true at the same time. Stop sharing. We could appeal to WIESEL's 1994 autobiography, "All Rivers Run to the Sea." And we could appeal to that to advocate the view that WIESEL kept his faith, damaged and changed as it may be. But we don't pay Knight its literary due when we narrow our reading down to that one interpretation. Great literature resembles life itself. At times, we can believe and not believe at the same time, can't we? It does not really matter if we read Knight as a memoir or as fiction, but we should always read it as literature. Thank you.